Thank you. Good sunny afternoon and welcome to this April 12th, 2020 council work session. I'm looking at the wrong script, but I think it's going to be okay. Thank you for joining us in this remote meeting format we're using in response to Governor Brown's Stay Home, Save Lives order. This format enables the City Council to meet and take care of business while keeping everyone safe. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. And I realize that I actually need a different script for this because there's more to say. Excuse me. Looking ahead, tonight's regular meeting will include a public forum. Information about how to participate is available on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. And as always, other avenues of communication with me and city councilors are always available, including email and voicemail. Thank you so much for joining us. And it's good to be back. It's good to see all of you gathered together. Thank you so much. I realized that I actually missed seeing you, and I'm happy to see you again. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to City Manager for our single topic today, the homelessness update.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I am really looking forward to this conversation tonight. It's largely going to be led by Christy and Matt, but I just wanted to say welcome back. I know there were a lot of conversations, especially about this topic during your break, so it may not have felt as much like a break as it normally does, but I know it's front and center for us and for the community. So I don't want to take up too much time, and I'll just ask Christy to jump into the presentation.
Thanks, Sarah. Mayor Binnis and councilors, as Sarah said, welcome back. We're really excited to be the first topic on your agenda as you come back, and it's a really important one. Tonight, Matt Rodriguez, Public Works Director, and I are here to talk about the status of homelessness in Eugene and provide a 6-month plan for thinking big, starting small, and acting fast. The purpose of our plan is really to provide for better outcomes for unhoused people, neighborhoods, and businesses so that we can work towards better solutions. Prior to the onset of the pandemic, it was clear that the growing number of unhoused people was reaching a crisis level. Three things were true then, and they remain true today. The homeless service system lacks adequate shelter support. Along the continuum of shelter, we have some really big gaps, especially in that emergency shelter response that we need to address. Neighborhoods, businesses, and shared public spaces are impacted when adequate shelter for unhoused people needing support is just not available. And we're seeing that all throughout our community. And honestly, it's not a good condition for unhoused people to be in terms of the services that they need. And lastly, the effort and the commitment to improving the system are high. The City of Eugene, Lane County, other regional partners, of course, our service providers, businesses, and community members want better solutions for helping the unhoused and fixing the problem. However, the impact of those efforts is often transactional, long-term, or lacks the adequate resources to fully realize sustained and measurable impacts. And what we really want to focus on are strategies that can help us change that direction. So what's the plan? The plan today that we want to share with you talks about what we think that we would like to accomplish in the next 6 months. It begins today with assessing the current conditions and impacts and provide council with policy options to improve the response, how we use our resources, and create some short and long-term positive change. This includes plans for discussing current code limitations to effective enforcement. That has come up a lot in the community, and we feel that's, and from council, and a very important topic to continue to discuss. The second step is expanding our capacity to accommodate safe sleeping spaces for 200 vehicles and 300 tent campers today while looking for future land needs. We want to keep a mindful eye on the long-term planning, looking for space that can accommodate transitioning unsheltered people from temporary urban camps and vehicle camping to dedicated spaces, with the thought that those spaces can evolve into Conestoga huts, pallet shelters, and perhaps permanent supportive shelter options in the future. Third step, and I would say that these are not necessarily linear, but all three very important. The third step is to consult and collaborate with our partners and providers, unhoused people, businesses, and neighborhoods, and to build on the successful models. We know we have experience and we know what works. We hear that from our providers and things that we should think about, and also from our neighbors, especially the ones that are living next to some of our successful shelters that can help provide better pathways forward. We want to work to eliminate the conditions that create instability for our unhoused people, neighborhoods, and our businesses. In addition, we'll also be sharing a range of costs for what we're proposing, potential funding options to help patch through to long-term funding stabilization for services. So in our next slide, we want to begin the discussion to remind you that we're committed to being engaged in a systems thinking approach to housing and homelessness. Recently, you heard from our Housing Tools and Strategies team regarding the launch of the Housing Implementation Pipeline, the HIP. Might be the coolest name of just about any program that we have. And that work is currently underway. As we think about the system-wide approach, I want to point out that the Lane County Shelter Feasibility Study provided by the Technical Assistance Collaborative, also known as the TAC, is a very important component of the system. We work closely with our partners at Lane County, led by Sarai Johnson, our homeless and housing strategist, to continue moving these efforts forward. So while today we're here to talk about the homeless and unsheltered, it's really, really important to keep an eye on where we need to go in the build out of the system as we address this major crisis that we have before us today. The specific area that we'll be focusing on with respect to the continuum is that for the homelessness and unsheltered in our community, that very first box, big arrow, can't miss it. So one of the things I want to do is start setting a little bit of context from a national perspective. In January, HUD provided their 2020 annual homeless assessment report to Congress. When considering the level of unsheltered homelessness in our community, it's helpful to understand the national context to which we reside. Currently, the West Coast, as you can see, the darker blue on the left side of the map, is experiencing a significant increase in the number of people experiencing homeless, and at a much higher rate than per capita than the rest of the nation. The report shared that this was the fourth consecutive year homelessness increased nationwide, and 2020 marks the first time since data collection began that more individuals were unsheltered than sheltered. I'm going to say that again because it's really, really important to what we're talking about today. So 2020 was the first time that more individuals who were experiencing being unsheltered than sheltered, and that's really, really critical, and it's the gap that we'll be talking about today. The report also states that 62% of the homeless individuals in Oregon are unsheltered. Our staff have been engaging with other cities along the I-5 corridor on the West Coast to understand what they've been experiencing and the various approaches that they've been taking to address unhoused, to provide shelter for the unhoused in their jurisdictions. And some of the plans that Matt will be talking about have taken that into consideration and as part of our longer term thinking. So as we think a little bit more locally in what's happening in Lane County, in February, 3,301 people experiencing homelessness access services during the month. Of that, about 2,500 of that population, or roughly 75%, reside in Eugene. These unduplicated individuals are entered into the homeless by name list when they access services through a provider that uses the HMIS system, which means that the number of homeless individuals in our area could be higher than what's represented here. And I think that we're seeing potentially the impacts of that and the growth that's happening that is not counted through the system by those who don't choose to access the services. In the next slide, we want to talk a little bit about some of the trends and things that are concerning our community. And this is a bit of a spoiler alert because you're going to be getting a great presentation from staff about the COVID survey that was done. As you can see by the yellow orange colored bar, front of mind for the community members is homelessness. It's a high priority and having significant impacts that are felt through the neighborhoods and by businesses, as well as our unsheltered. And everybody wants to continue to find a solution to this really urgent problem. Staff will be sharing more details, as I said, about this on Wednesday. So as we think about, as we moved into last spring, what we know is that COVID has been a game changer, and that's really an understatement. If there's a lesson that we've learned is that in the midst of this unprecedented time, it's really important that we consider our long-term plans for our most vulnerable in our community. And the pandemic really taught us a lot about how we can improve in that response. At the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, in order to support the community health and reduce potential spread of the virus, the City of Eugene temporarily adjusted its enforcement process around prohibited camping to help people shelter in place and reduce the need to move around in the community. This approach aligned with the recommendations from the CDC, Oregon Health Authority, and the Lane County Public Health. The city also deployed outreach teams, portable restrooms, hand washing, and waste supports. Next slide. Prior to the onset of COVID, there were approximately 845 units of shelter in Eugene, including family units that can accommodate more than one individuals. Due to the pandemic, our local shelters, our congregate shelters, had to significantly reduce the density of shelter beds to adapt to the public health guidance and reduce the risk of the spread of the virus. This had pretty significant impacts to our unhoused population. At that time, we established 4 designated temporary shelter sites at the Eugene Community Centers. These sites provided shelter and access to social services, as well as food, water, health screening, and education. Through this stabilization, individuals staying in the designated temporary shelter sites were able to transition to new microsites that the city partnered with CCS to create at the Mission and the Skinner City Farm. Last fall, City Council also approved 5 new rest stops. Nearly all of those are online now, which is a really big deal for our unhoused, and just can't give enough positive feedback to the staff and to our partners who made that happen. That work has created up to 100 new units of safe and supportive shelter, a model that we know works for getting people into better places in their lives and transitioning to more permanent housing. We also added a small number of spots for car camping program, and we continue to look for more capacity in partnership with St. Vincent de Paul. In the spring of 2020, the county utilized the Lane County Fairgrounds as a temporary shelter and has since been offering hotel vouchers for vulnerable population. All of this work has been aimed at slowing the spread of COVID-19, and we believe it played a valuable role in limiting the prevalence in our community. Additionally, we are pleased to be able to utilize emergency resources to stand up shelter options that would continue beyond the pandemic. In total, about 300 new units were created throughout the new rest stops, microsites, pallet shelters, COVID-19 hotel vouchers, and the joint response by the city and the county to help serve our vulnerable population. These efforts were fast, and even with all of these efforts, the new units created, we know that many individuals are still sleeping unsheltered in vehicles, parks, and other public spaces, and the impacts from the unsheltered homelessness are being experienced throughout the community. The next slide is a map that shows where the shelter locations are located throughout Eugene. Currently, there are about 30 locations across the city. Some are reserved for families, others target youth and veterans, and included in this number are spaces for overnight parking program. So with that, Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about where we go from here.
Thank you, Christy. See if I can advance this slide. So given the continuing pandemic and the lack of available non-congregate shelter, we've continued to temporarily adjust our enforcement around prohibited camping. As COVID-19 cases surged in the fall, and infections increased in the local population of people experiencing homelessness. We clarified our criteria to set expectations that need to be met for camps to stay in place and defined areas where camping would be prioritized for enforcement. These criteria, which were included in your AIS, were built around health and safety, both for people and the environment, and maintaining social distancing guidelines to limit the spread of the virus. This graph represents requests for service over the last year related to prohibited camping. The top line in dark blue represents vehicle camping. The light blue line near the bottom of the page represents camping in parks, and the green line represents tent camping in the right-of-ways. While requests for services for tent camping in parks and right-of-ways have been pretty consistent, and in some cases, as you see in parks, have tailed off a little bit, and we think that's a little bit due to the larger camps we're supporting in Washington Jefferson Park and at 13th and Chambers right now. We've seen a very sharp increase in the number of requests for services for vehicle camping. If we were to take a longer term look at this graph, you would see that year over year, we've seen a steady uptick with more and more requests. It's especially true for rights of ways and vehicle camping that have started to accelerate. Here you can see geographically where people are camping. This map shows camping work orders from March of 2020 to March of 2021. There's a concentration of people along waterways near I-105 in West Eugene, in parks right-of-ways and in vehicles just across the city. So it may be hard to see, but the orange triangle is state land. And for us, that's mostly what would have been along the south, the South Bank and North Bank of the Willamette River under Washington Jefferson, which we now have under lease. Yellow is right-of-ways. And red is car camping and green is parks. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of distribution. It really is all across the city. We know there's a significant cost associated with unsanctioned camping. This picture is from a cleanup along the Willamette River. This is right along the North Bank path. It just kind of illustrates the extent of camp cleanup that we need to do for some of these camps. From January to March of this year, we spent about $200,000 over that 3-month period, and that's across parks and open space, right-of-ways, and car camping. During those cleanup efforts, we removed about 650 cubic yards of trash. And we know even at that level of spending, that level of service is really not meeting the community need for assistance in this area. As we saw in the earlier graph, rates of vehicle camping have been sharply increasing. This has resulted in significant impacts to residents and businesses adjacent to vehicle camping. And we know this is particularly acute in the West Eugene commercial and industrial areas. Impacts have included blocking streets and access for large commercial vehicles, large amounts of trash, human waste, and in some cases, threatening behavior by campers to people living and working nearby, and criminal activity. Earlier today, we provided a document to you that highlights code limitations to effective enforcement of vehicle camping. And staff plan to schedule a separate work session to present these code limitations and potential code amendments to address them. Through shelter-in-place approach, we've also had the opportunity to better understand the benefits to people experiencing homelessness, including stabilization and consistent access and connection to services. We've had ongoing conversations with social service providers, and they've really talked about the importance of knowing where their clients are for continuous care. Most people experiencing homelessness, have some type of medical challenge that they need assistance with, and having that kind of connection, knowing where people are, is really helpful. If one of their clients is staying at a particular location, they know where to find them for follow-up treatment. We also continue to hear from community members about the challenges to neighborhoods and businesses, including behavioral issues. As I talked about with vehicle camping, these problem behaviors include large amounts of trash, human waste, blocking access, reports of theft, drug use, illegal weapons, and other criminal activity. We also recognize there's a cost in the loss of public space for other members of the community, as well as the resources diverted to supporting these efforts. For instance, community members can't use Washington Jefferson Park for its intended purposes. And we've heard about concerns from people that, walking and recreating near areas where we have large concentrations of people camping. A key lesson we've learned is that every site used as a place for people experiencing homelessness to shelter needs some level of management and support to be successful. And lastly, we continue to coordinate with other cities across the West Coast, as Christy mentioned, to learn what they're doing and to share actually what we're doing to address homelessness. And a few of those cities that we've been talking with include Medford, Bend, Salem, Portland, and San Diego. So what's the plan to move forward from here? So to start, the city manager has activated a unified command structure. This is an incident command structure. It's similar to how we've structured our COVID-19 Emergency Operations Center, if you're familiar with that. It brings staff together across the city departments to add a resource and really focus to develop and implement the post-COVID-19 transition plan for people experiencing homelessness. Our priorities for the Unified Command include support for stabilization of people experiencing homelessness, reducing neighborhood and business impacts, building partnership capacity and relationships, identifying land for expansion of shelters, which I'll talk about in a second, and building trust through external and internal communications with the community. This team is working with partners to identify land and develop site programming, and is targeting creation of about 300 new tent spaces and 200 new car camping spaces. And we know that's a big lift, but we think that's really what we need to start moving this in a different direction. We also plan to increase outreach in order to support efforts to demobilize temporary camping locations such as Washington Jefferson Park, 13th and Chambers, and support relocation of on-street vehicle camping as we stand up these new sites. And as we transition these locations, we'll resume enforcement to support the return of these spaces to their intended function and to reduce the current and future impacts to businesses and neighborhoods. This is another way to visualize this work we proposed for the Unified Command, and we're really talking about a 6-month transition plan. And that's really in 4 parts. It's engage partners, secure new sites, expand outreach, and ensure compliance. And now I'm going to hand the presentation back over to Christy.
Thank you, Matt. So as Matt was talking, I'm sure many of you are wondering, what is the cost to working to implement to implement these strategies? And there is a cost, as there is a cost to doing nothing as well. We have some indication based upon these estimated costs using the existing city models and what we know has worked. And again, I think that one of the critical pieces, Matt and I have been fortunate enough to talk with the provider group that we work very, very closely with, who have provided some really meaningful insights about how we go about setting up the tent sites, the car sites, and think about our response overall. As we think about the cost for these sheltering strategies, one of the things that is at the forefront is that we could consider leasing or purchasing land for tent and vehicle sites. There's a cost, often, as we know from our experience in creating the microsites and the rest stop, for the preparation or the site development in order to actually make them usable space. There's ongoing operations, staffing, and then that important connection to navigation services. Our intent by offering up these options is to make sure that people have meaningful places to move to, so that we don't stay in this particular temporary situation any longer than necessary. If we were to purchase land, we would be doing so with the current and potential future use in mind, such as transitioning sites to emergency shelter, permanent supportive housing, or affordable housing in the long term. We've amassed a team that's specifically looking for sites in partnership with our colleagues at the county. And what we're looking at is not only private or public property, but we're also looking at private property that might be for sale, talking with our colleagues at the chamber to see if there are other properties that aren't being used right now in the business community that might be able to be repurposed for some sort of a purpose to serve these sites. When we think about the 300 safe tent camping sites, we're looking at groups of up to 40 tents per site, which we estimate to be 4 to 8 locations, which will include services. With respect to the 200 safe car camping sites, we're assuming up to 60 vehicles, and this is dependent upon council taking action on the ordinance language that you received in your agenda item summary, and that would be approximately 2 to 4 sites. The camping response is really just how we support this work, support the right-of-way work and parks, really stay focused on the outreach, enforcement, and cleanup. As we gain clarity around these potential, so the next thing on this, Matt, could you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Potential funding sources, there's a few of them, and there's some uncertainty, and most of them are short term. So with respect to how we look to the future in funding, what we know is that the city manager, this is also a spoiler alert because the fiscal year 22 budget isn't out yet, but the city manager's proposed budget has designated $750,000, $300,000 in ongoing and $450,000 in one-time money to provide staffing to coordinate our camp response, enhance our communications with our community and business members, and continue to make progress on our homeless systems transformation work, as well as support camp cleanup. There's also $600,000 earmarked within the CDBG CV3 package that will be coming to you at your work session on April 26th. This includes $400,000 for outreach and $200,000 for navigation services. I want to add and thank the coordination that's happening with our partners at Lane County with respect to the $400,000. City staff have been working closely with them to define what that outreach looks like to meet the needs of our community. The city has also submitted a request to the legislature for $3.5 million for the acquisition of land and site development for these new tent and car camping sites. If we were able to acquire that $3.5 million, we could use that for the purposes of establishing these different sites. And additionally, we're also awaiting HUD guidance on the $4.8 million allocation to Eugene Springfield through the Home Consortium to understand more about how those dollars can be spent and whether any portion of that funding source can be directed towards these efforts. Just in some context, Eugene would typically receive about 76% of the dollars coming into the community based on the existing formula. As we gain clarity around these potential resources, we will also be looking towards city allocation of the federal ARP funding. At this time, we're continuing to talk about plans about how those dollars can be resourced, but that could be a source of one-time funding that actually would be available for through about 2024. And finally, I think one of the key things is to continue to think about how we leverage the dollars coming into communities. And so we talk a lot with our Lane County partners around how to optimize the dollars that we both are receiving to do the most that we can for the community based upon the strengths of the different services that we provide. And so we know that we are already engaging in conversation about how to do that with respect to these sites and how we can work together. Last slide, if you wouldn't mind, Matt. So to accomplish this plan, we kind of want to think about this in 4 different council policy direction points. The first is the one that we were asking for some direction on tonight, which is the temporary expansion of safe parking and safe tent camping sites. This would allow for up to 60 car spaces and 40 tent spaces per site. We hope that if council so desires that we can schedule this for a public hearing on April 26th. This is a really critical first step because, as Matt mentioned, we have developed a unified command team. A big part of that team is actually looking for land, and how we're able to utilize the land that's available by the amount that we can accomplish per site is really critical in how we think about what we're looking at. So we're really looking forward to that conversation. In addition, on-street car and RV camping, we want to schedule a work session to discuss code limitations and solutions. I know that's a very, very important topic as it relates to some of the areas at West Eugene that are feeling the impacts of the number of people that are sleeping in cars and RVs and want to be able to support them in different ways. So we would propose scheduling that work session, and depending on the outcome, it could end end up moving to an ordinance for public hearing for potential changes. Land lease purchase options, what we'd anticipate as we find land for lease or purchase, that we would come back and talk with council and talk about the costs associated with that purchase or lease. We would also at that time envision that we'd be talking about specific site support and program options. And the reason I wanted to talk a little bit about the site support and programs options is really because we've received such, as I mentioned, such great feedback from our service providers about how we really think about the locations and who is served at those locations. And so that might require different structuring or different programming, but we want to make sure that we come back and talk with you about it. And lastly, the slide that I already touched on was funding and talking about the partnerships, looking for not only how we partner with Lane County, but also other regional partners to achieve the greatest good and to figure out how to use the dollars for the best and highest purpose to serve our vulnerable population. As we think about funding that we're using, one of the things, and I know that council has talked about this several times during our TAC discussions, is to think about the short-term and the long-term strategies. A lot of the money that we've been able to use has been one time, or maybe will last a couple of years. And one of the things that Brooke Fried in our city manager's office is doing is being mindful and has put together a chart that shows when that funding runs out and when we will need more long-term strategies to sustain the programs if council so chooses to do so. And lastly, I'll just turn it over to the mayor, and Matt and we have some other folks here that would be happy to answer questions from you or council. Thank you.
Mayor, can I say one more thing? I apologize. So one thing we did want to bring to your attention, you got a late email that Catherine sent to you. After we talked with service providers late last week, we heard a lot of feedback that having a longer pilot program, if we're really able to engage them in the work, they need a little bit longer timeline in order to gear up and be able to have, kind of a predictable level of service in providing support. So we're actually asking that the time period of the proposed ordinance is 2 years instead of 1, so that it would have a revised sunset date of May 1st, 2023. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for all of the work that this presentation represents. It's really extraordinary, very thorough. I'm actually inspired by what you're proposing and very kind of encouraged by how deliberative and how thoughtful this is and how thorough. So thank you very much for that report. It was really, really interesting. And counselors have lined up. So first we have Alan, then Mike, then Randy.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. I'll ditto what the mayor said. It's a lot of work that's already and thinking that's gone into this, and I think it's going in the right direction. A while ago, I had the realization, came to the conclusion, as many others did probably at the same time, that we needed to rethink our homelessness services and our approach. And our small sites of 1 to 20 and other programs, the kind of silver buckshot approach, that was for you, Mike, just wasn't cutting it. And we weren't able to react to the COVID pandemic. And even though we've done probably more than any other city in the West Coast, the pandemic made it just that much worse. The non-congregate spacing and the shelters in place order by the CDC and the guidelines really brought it home for me and for a lot of people. And it's, as you saw, it's really a West Coast problem, all up and down the West Coast. And that makes sense given our temperate climate and weather. But it's not just a few places, and certainly not just in Eugene. It's all over the West. And it's not just a couple of places in the city, it's all over the city, as you saw from that map. So, and the complaints for car camping have skyrocketed from over 1,000 in a month, when other ones totaled about 200 for other kinds of camping. So we really need to provide bigger, more controlled, managed sites, and more of them, and bigger. And we need places for people to go. And safe parking and safe tent sites, 60 and 40 respectively. Maybe that's too small, but it's a good place to start. But we needed to change our own rules, and that's what this ordinance is about, as well as the overall plan. And we can use federal dollars to help buy the land and set this up, but we still have the ongoing cost of $5 to $6 million a year to figure out, because this isn't going to go away anytime necessarily really soon. So the community has not been supportive of us spending money on this in the past when we've done surveys and asked. And I think it's gotten bad enough that they are now supportive of it. And, I mentioned I'm putting together, and I hope to have it done by today, but I didn't get to finish it off, polish it off enough this weekend, about a levy strategy, combining it with climate change projects that would get us a big enough coalition to get to yes on it. But finally, homelessness is the symptom. The problem is lack of affordable housing, lack of mental health services, and lack of substance abuse access to services. And homelessness is this. So we have to look at all of those things to get this solved. I'll need around 2, Mayor.
Well, all right. Thank you. Next up is Mike and then Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate staff's work. I appreciate their attempt to respond to what is an ever-growing problem, and it's gotten out of hand. It's my belief that once we hit the fall and into the winter, we've only just seen the beginning of how bad it may get. And I have for some time had an issue with the silver buckshot, Alan. I don't agree with the general direction of overarching policy on this. And so I guess I would ask the first question of the manager. Are the CDC guidelines to shelter in place truly guidelines, or are they an edict? Are they law? If so, where's the authority from? In other words, why do we have to comply with that?
I would say that they're guidelines that have been strongly encouraged to us by all of our public health partners. So I don't believe it's an edict or a law. And if you want to take a different direction with that, we probably can.
Okay, and that's really the thing, is that the complaints we get from the community and from at least my constituents that I've heard from on this, and friends, associates in the community, is that we seem to be prioritizing that guidance over the impact on neighborhoods and businesses. And I think we may be not on the right track there. We may need to consider that congregate shelter may, even though it presents some risks, may be the less impact option compared to what's currently happening, and as it grows as a problem, what the members of our community are experiencing because of it. We have $15 million sitting in a bank account, and in my perfect world, we buy about 5 or 6 more very large sprung structures like we have the first one, and create a centralized emergency system for housing so that the police can do their job to enforce illegal camping. But I don't sense that we're going to do that. So I look at this and I say, this is a good first step. But the element, in my opinion, that we're missing is that we're providing a lot of opportunity for folks to have a different option. But we're not doing anything to address those who don't want to or refuse to take the option of another path, of another place to shelter. There are certainly many people who need help and that I want to help, who would take any option that puts them inside the law and puts them on a path to recovery in this realm in regard to homelessness. But there are folks who want to live rough, and we aren't addressing those. And that's the failure that I think we really have to address before we get a better handle on this problem. So I like what we're doing. I'm just not sure it's quite enough. And I need a second round, please, Mayor.
Okay, Randy and then Claire.
Thank you, Mayor. I too will need a second round. I do have two motions I want to make tonight, but I do not want them to get in the way of this discussion on the presentation and the original motions. I have a lot to say. I have questions. I agree with what Councillor Clark said. I do appreciate the work where we're trying to help people less fortunate than ourselves and give a hand up for those who want and need help. At the same time, I also have compassion for our workers, especially what they've been experiencing in West Eugene. I will point out that the map that was presented showing the individual complaints, it stopped at Danabo. It did not extend to Terry or Eggcone Boulevard, where Owens Loop is, where a recent city count came up with 67 RVs, trailers, large vehicles, and 33 cars in a very small geographical area. And despite the fact that we have portable toilets in that area, raw sewage is being dumped directly on the street and into our wetlands. We have both unhoused and our workers that are experiencing intolerable conditions and are living with uncorrected violations. In fact, if you look at attachment E in the packet, the COVID-19 public health criteria, we are not even capable right now of enforcing the rules we have for ourselves under that criteria. And if you read through that, every one of those is basically being violated. So that does concern me, but I don't want to keep ranting on about that. I think you've seen enough of my emails over time that you know that I'm very frustrated for our workers and our businesses in West Eugene. You've read some of the intimidation and the challenging, and I've actually experienced it myself in my dozens of times into the area. And additionally, the picture that was shown depicting the camps in the streets, I personally haven't seen it that clean. But anyway, moving on, regarding the proposed ordinance, what process is the city going through to identify the safe sites, and how quickly can we expect these to be identified?
Matt, I'll start, and if you want to jump in. So, Councilor Groves, thanks for the question. I appreciate the comments. So, one of the things that we've been doing is we've developed a 5-person team to work with the partners at the county. We initially started by assessing the property that we own to look at what we might be able to do that way. And as mentioned, what we're hoping is that by within a month that we'll have some options to bring forward from that team to start, because we need to move. We want to act quickly, as I was talking about. And so our intent is to, as soon as we have something, to not wait to have the list fully complete, but to continue to bring back what we have as quickly as we can to determine how, if the site is a viable one for council consideration, and if so, what are the potential uses for that site and what we think we can do programming wise. Matt, I don't know if you want to speak at all to any of the criteria that we're using or.
No, I think you hit it, Christy. We've got a number of additional public property locations that we're looking at, although it's a hard fit, but we're really looking in a different way at partnerships as we look at this. We've been talking with the county. We've been talking with the chamber about how we might look at this more in partnership and find places that will work for these sites.
Okay. And then how are we bringing in private landowners to help with the process? Are they at the table? And then also, do we have a plan for how we're going to engage neighbors and businesses in the area so that they are a part of the process? They know what's going on. They have a chance to weigh in and help us mold or shape these camps in a way that reduces impact on them.
So one of the things I think Matt might have touched on this is that we have designated a business outreach person, Ed Russo, who is on our staff. Ed Russo is also going to be working on the land selection site team, and will be coordinating with businesses and making sure that we stay connected. And there might be, as I mentioned when I was talking, there might be some properties out there that don't have a for sale sign, but could be used that a business or a property owner might want to bring forward. And so we also want to think about what is, how we could lease property in that way too. So that's part of what we're doing too, Councilor Groves.
Thank you. I appreciate the extra detail there too. Hopefully we are also coming up with a strategy for how we're going to enforce the rules in the camps for the safety of the inhabitants and the surrounding people. I mean, one of the challenges that we've had in West Eugene, there are no rules. It's the Wild West out here, and some way that we can establish the rules and then enforce them is going to be critical to this being successful. And I see I'm running out of time, so I don't know if you have a response for that, but Mayor, if I could be in that second queue, thank you.
It'll just be short, Mayor. Councilor Groves, one of the things that you saw in that third tier of expenses has to do with right of way. And so that would provide more assistance to help with those problems in that area, to be more quickly available and readily available to address and respond to those calls for service and address the needs. So there's a component there that's very focused on that, and we will continue to work on the implementation and operations of that strategy based on staff recommendations and understanding what the business and neighborhoods need.
Thank you. I didn't get that from that, but I'll go back and reread it.
Okay, Claire and then Jennifer.
Thanks. I think I can get through mine in 3 minutes. So I just want to confirm and ask staff, you can shake your heads yes or no, that we are still pursuing the strategies laid out in the Technical Assistant Collaborative report. So I think that's important to share with the community, that what we're talking about tonight is a tactical response to this acute crisis. It's not our strategy for reducing homelessness. We're still working on upstream and program support pieces to help keep people from falling into homelessness and also to get them back into housing. So I support the proposal by staff, and I'm really glad that the city manager has created an incident command around this issue. I think it warrants that level of attention. But I also don't disagree with Councilor Clark. I think that, when we're looking at the potential of getting some money from the Recovery Act or another source, that a sprung structure or two might be a really viable option for providing that emergency shelter, and then can be repurposed to something else in the future if we reach our goals outlined in the tax report. So I just wanted to share that I met with staff, some of the staff who's briefing us today, to communicate, and something I communicated in an email as well, about Washington Jefferson Park, and relay the concerns from neighbors about the size of that camp, and that Whitaker, once again, is being asked to shoulder a disproportionate share of the burden that our community carries when it comes to providing places for people to be. And I keep pointing out that this is in large part due to the fact that several decades ago, ODOT chose to split our neighborhood in two. I live in Whitaker, to put in the I-105 on and off ramp. The citizens didn't get a say in that. We didn't get to vote on it. They just did it. And now we have this essential attractive nuisance in the middle of our neighborhood. And ever since that, our neighborhood has been subject to more activity due to this park that often has a negative impact on businesses and the homes located right across the street from the park. So it's important to me to raise that up. At the same time, Whitaker residents are very compassionate and tolerant about illegal campers, especially if they keep their site clean, they're not engaging in illegal or disruptive activities. I have 2 car campers on my street right now. Nobody's calling the police on them. Nobody's in a hullabaloo about them because they are safe and quiet and neighborly. We are a low to moderate income neighborhood, and we understand what it means for people to struggle. So when my neighbors start complaining about the level of camping in our neighborhood, it means things have become really dire. And I would like a second round.
Okay, that's great. Jennifer and then Matt.
Thank you. All right, so thankfully, Councilor Grove asked some of my questions. So you said it would take you about a month to come back with a list of viable options for this. And so I'm wondering, after that, about how long before move-in does it normally take? Because I think it's like several months, right, at least?
Oh, I hope not. Councilor Ye, I think what our hope is that we want to find the sites. There's going to be sites that we're going to find, especially if council chooses to send the ordinance to a public hearing, that we might consider that are larger. Some of those might take a little bit more site prep, some might not. There might be some gravel surfaced areas out there that can be readily transitioned. And so it's really just about seeing what we can find. Our hope is that we're going to work up front to develop the best plans for the sites. One of the things that we heard from providers is to think about how that might be family groups or people that have single adults, people that have specific needs, and try to think about how to triage and use the site specific to align those services. So the short answer is that I hope that it's not months. I mean, we have a 6-month strategy to get this in place, but we also want to be iterative and we want to be able to act as quickly as possible. And so if anybody has a lead on sites that they think would be good, please let Matt and I know. We want to pursue all options. So.
Okay, that's great. My second question was kind of on what Claire was talking about. Do we expect that this effort will impact our work on the TAC that we're doing with the county in any way?
No. What we expect is that we continue to move forward. We'll continue to have the joint elected officials meetings. Brooke and I and others that are already working with the county will continue to do so. And we are working with them on this because we realize what a critical, important piece it is to help people to understand the need and how to have the capacity that we need to move upstream of the temporary shelter situation.
Okay, and you guys mentioned wanting to come back. Oh, I'm sorry, did I interrupt somebody?
I'm sorry, Councilor. Yeah, I was just going to add the one way I think it could impact it is if we do have stable locations for people to be, that it's easier to have contact with them and bring them into the system. So I think that could be a positive impact on the TAC implementation.
Well, that would be awesome. Yes. My last thing was you mentioned wanting to come back with some recommendations around parking issues, but you didn't mention when that might happen, because it seems like it's kind of direly, it's a really big issue right now. And if I'm just looking at our calendar, it's pretty packed for a while. So
the city manager and I today were talking about potential options for coming back, but our goal would be to come back definitely before the end of April to move that discussion along.
Okay, great. If it was going to be a long time, that would really concern me, but that seems pretty reasonable considering how busy we are. So lastly, I just want to say this is really great work, and you can tell from this that you've already been working on it, even though we kind of asked you to bump everything up. This has clearly been percolating for a long time, and anytime I talk to staff or we went out and looked at a site, I'm always impressed by how they're just looking for solutions, right? Everyone just, I know I get more frustrated than staff, and I really appreciate that attitude, and you just come ready to do the work. And this is great. This is great stuff. So I appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt, and then Greg.
Thanks, Mayor. I've got three questions I want to ask, revolving around: 1, metrics for success; 2, I want to touch on the land acquisition and public engagement with the private sector; and 3, long-term funding. And before I do, I want to express gratitude for our staff and our service providers for the thoughtful presentation and the proposal. In addition, I want to push back with respect on a comment one of my colleagues said at the top of this conversation. I fundamentally believe, and I hope colleagues on council do, that in the midst of a global pandemic dealing with an airborne virus that knows no political, geographic, or socioeconomic boundaries, it is wholly irresponsible to ignore CDC and public health guidelines. I would hope that city staff and this council would continue to embrace and adhere to CDC and public health recommendations. In addition, and leaning toward the question about metrics, more than half of the unhoused population requires medical attention, I believe was the stat that Matt brought up earlier. More than half of our unhoused population requires medical attention. There's a moratorium on evictions that will be expiring in 2.5 months. in 1 year, we've seen car camping go from 337 vehicles to 879 vehicles. While I celebrate the success of 4 structure sites and at community centers, 5 new rest stops, a total of 300 new units out of approximately 2,500 unhoused individuals, that's a success rate of 12%. So my first question is, what is the metric for success? Is it a 30% threshold? Is it, would batting 300 be a success? Would a 50% threshold be a success? I'll pause there, and I've got a couple more follow-ups.
Matt, do you go ahead, Matt?
Well, yeah, I think that's a great point, Councillor Keating. I think ultimately it's up to council to decide what the metric for success is for our community. We've come up with these numbers knowing that 500 sites, which means you probably have a little more than 500 people across the 300 car sites or 200 car sites and 300 tent sites. It doesn't address the 2,400 we see in the homeless by name list per month, but it starts to provide some room in the system to give people an option of where to be. And as we build that, we can start to see what the reaction is to that. All right, what does the problem look like now? How do we iterate this? We're kind of in an indeterminate math problem where you have to try something and see how that influences the problem and whether or not you need more resource or maybe less. So I don't have a great answer for that, but we're really looking for council to help us understand what success looks like.
No, copy that. You eat an apple one bite at a time, and so there's no silver bullet or magic wand. So multiple answers are appropriate and applauded. Land acquisition. I appreciate staff's request for $3.5 million land acquisition. That would be one-time usage. What's the engagement plan with the public and the private sector? Is it an Engage Eugene strategy? And I heard at some point someone said you can contact Christy and you can contact Matt, which is great for those of us who are on this call. But how does the private sector say, I want to have buy-in, and what sort of incentives perhaps are being discussed, and what can council do to be helpful?
I'll just speak to that a little bit and let Christy jump in. I think that's part of what we'll continue to rapidly develop. I love the idea of an Engage Eugene site, actually, Councillor Keating, something that puts out there what we're looking for, what the potential benefits are to landowners that are interested in this, and how we start to engage the community on sites. But we're really taking, like what we said in the last answer, one step at a time, realizing we're going to need to have that outreach. And we're just building relationships and connections right now, and we'll continue to refine that and be able to provide you more information as we go along.
Great, thanks. And I'm a yes to Councillor Zelenka's request for a work session. However, I long for polling that supports a levy or a bond approach. Fundamentally, I believe there are other tactics to embrace, and I look forward to discussing those in the second round, Mayor.
Okay, Greg, and then we're ready for second rounds.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I want to thank staff for this presentation. I have a couple of questions, more specifically around the role that our police department is playing in this, and maybe Chief Skinner, you can jump in here on this. Our current and past practices of doing sweeps clearly has failed. What has happened is we've got people who, you move them out of a troubled spot, and then a week later they come back to that same spot. And it seems that those situations get bigger and bigger and bigger. In addition to that, the number of crimes that are being reported, and not just on businesses, but also the homeless themselves. Some of them don't report those crimes or criminal activity. So they're being intimidated. Businesses are being intimidated. Employees of businesses are being intimidated. And we have to disaggregate those people who I consider legitimately homeless, who really are down on their luck, versus people who are predators, who prey on the homeless, and they're preying on our business community as well. And I know the constraints we have with the jail and with the criminal justice system right now, but we have to figure out how we can address those particular issues. I was over around 7th and Bertelsen the other night on Friday night, and I talked to some of the business owners over there, and saw the RVs that were parked there. The garbage is piled up. We've got some serious issues, particularly with people who have mental health needs. So one of the things that I want to try to address and want to ask is this: would it be appropriate for us to ask for FEMA money in an emergency context to deal with what's going on the street, what's happening there, and then in terms of our human services situation, what is the current capacity of Lane County to help and develop specific strategies to help those people who are on the streets, who need that kind of treatment or that kind of service, and try to get them in a much better position, even if we can't house them. We want to be able to put them in safe places that will not cause a lot of neighborhood or business disruption. So 2 questions there.
The first question that you asked was around FEMA funding, and that's something that Matt and I have been checking into to find out what is there a path forward to be able to access funding depending on the level of our crisis and how we would go about doing that. At this point, that's still under exploration. Not sure if that is an option, but Matt, do you have anything to add to that particular question? Okay. And then with Human Services partner at Lane County and understanding what their capacity is, Burke Freed, our city manager's office division manager, works very closely with Steve Manella, Sarai Johnson, and others at the county. The county is working very hard to build capacity. And I think that one of the continued challenges that is the same as it is for service providers is the ability to just find enough people to fill all the spaces that they need. So they are looking at adding more case management work, working with us on outreach teams. And as you know, they're working on their mental health crisis response through the work that's happened with the PSCC and the funding that's come to the region, which is absolutely critical component to this system. And they're really looking to build upon that. And so those are the ways in which we are working with our partner, and that our partner is being really proactive in trying to find solutions.
But, and I know I'm out of time, so I need a second round.
Okay, I guess we're ready for second rounds. We'll roll right into it. Emily, I'll give you a first round. You weren't on the list yet. Gotcha.
Mute, unmute, mute. Thank you. I don't have a lot to say. I think my colleagues are covering a lot of topics very well. I appreciate the tremendous amount of work this is. And I support the ordinance change for bigger sites. And I don't know. I know we can't do things faster than this and that it's already going lickety-split, but I have so much frustration with what's going on every single day, both out west and on WJ and over on 13th. And I know the public does too. And I don't know what the answer to this is, but I know people are desperate to see us do something, and I don't know. I know you don't either, but I just want to recognize that this isn't a long-term crisis. It's also a day-to-day crisis, which is exhausting for everybody: staff, electeds, homeless, neighbors, criminals, justice system. So it's not going to do any good, but I just want to put out this universal frustration we have little camaraderie there. And I cannot wait for us to have an option so that when it comes to a decision of will you enact this heinous thing, and it's like, sure, if they have somewhere else to go. But when they don't, we're stuck in this, just turning around with COVID. You can't move, and everybody, we're all upset. So I read your letters. I'm listening to you. I hear you. And when I figure it out, we'll be happy. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, Alan and then Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree with everything that everybody said so far. Again, the symptom is homelessness. The problem is mental health services, substance abuse services, which were 50th out of 50 states, by the way, and affordable housing, which we know is in crisis. And then adding the pandemic onto all of this just accentuates the crisis. So here we are. I think this is a really good proposal. It adds to our silver buckshot approach. One more tool, but bigger, and I think more effective, at least for the near term. It's very responsive and will help with a lot of the frustration the community feels, as all do we. I just wanted to say, Matt and Christy, this is really good work. You guys have structured something and thought about this and put together something that's really a good framework for us moving forward and helping alleviate some of this frustration and help solve the problem. One of the questions I had about that is, some of it's been answered, but what's the process for approving the new sites and purchasing land? What's the council's role? What's the public engagement process? So it's the process around that. How does that going to move forward? Because that's going to be the next step. I think that's going to be somewhat controversial. No, it will be controversial. Sorry.
Sarah, I wasn't sure if you wanted to weigh in on that or if you wanted me to jump in or.
Yeah, no, I can weigh in on that, because I think, our idea when we first started thinking about purchasing land was that you could sort of transition the site and transition the people in some cases together. And I know it won't come out that perfectly or beautifully, but it wouldn't be potentially not a long-term emergency shelter site like this, but could potentially transition into some other type of housing. And so one of the things that I appreciate about doing it without federal funds is that it creates a lot more flexibility in the type of housing. So we've often heard concerns that some of the really innovative ways of doing small houses and little villages doesn't really line up with the HUD model. So there may be other opportunities to partner with that we don't have right now. So in terms of outreach, I think that's going to be, it's a really good question as to how much you want to be in that sort of driver's seat around that or not. And I think we're going to need to talk about that more.
What about council's role in picking the sites and proving? What's that going to look like? Yeah, that's what I'm not exactly, I haven't really thought through what that process would be. And maybe Catherine can, I don't know if you have a legal piece about what council will actually need to do, but I think we want to be thoughtful about, do you want to approve every site, or do you want to give more general direction that doesn't have those individual decisions coming to you? Yeah, so all of that around also with the need to move fairly quickly.
Yeah. And I can add, the ordinance is currently drafted that it would be just by motion approval. A council motion could approve a site, and then it's drafted with the desire to have flexibility and speed, and also give council the options to kind of tailor how they want these sites to function. So there isn't kind of a one size fits all where you are actually trying to take a site and fit it into your pre-adopted code provisions, versus giving yourselves the flexibility that you would approve the the site, and then maybe tailor some restrictions around it or regulations around it for that particular site. So currently as drafted by motion, you would just approve the site.
Thanks. Thanks, Mayor.
Okay, Mike and then Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to say first to my friend, Councilor Keating, I don't think anybody's suggesting that we ignore CDC guidelines wholesale. I think what I was trying to say, if I did it inarticulately, was that our response is unbalanced in a manner that's pretty clear to most people, that what we're seeing is consequences borne by the community that are excessive. So Randy asked a really good question at one point that we went through quickly. And it was, I think, more of a, he was saying we would expect that there will be rules in these camps that we're creating. Can I get more detail from someone about what that response entails? What will be the rules in these camps that we're creating?
Well, our sanctioned camps that we have today, we have, guidelines for our expectations of the people that are participating in the camp. One of the things that Peter Chauvin has been working really closely with the neighborhoods and surrounding areas on is good neighbor agreements, and really working to collaborate closely. And he did that a lot with the Downtown Resource Center, and how he was understanding what was important to the surrounding businesses and residents in terms of what they expect and how they expect in operations. And the intent is that it's not just a one and done dialogue, especially for some of those smaller sites in particular, but I think it's going to be important for the larger sites too, is that it's an ongoing collaboration. How are things going? Are they still, are we meeting the expectations? Are the behavioral things that we said that we would monitor, and how is that going? So it's more of a relationship and an ongoing dialogue for that surrounding area. But Peter has already started a lot of that work, and the work that he's done to set up, he and Reagan and Brooke have done to set up the other sites, and it goes well. It creates an open line of communication. We would want to continue to establish that, if that helps.
Kind of. What I was asking is, what rules will there be?
We could get you a little bit more information about that. If that would be
Will
helpful.
drug use be okay in any of the camps that we're sponsoring?
It's a good question. We will have low barrier shelters, and I see Brooke's face. Maybe she's got some very specific response with guidelines that she has.
Yeah, as currently conceived, drug use is not allowed on these sites. Similar to our rest stop model and other programming, we don't allow use on sites. We would potentially, consider what parameters of a particular location, depending on the occupants. For example, if it was a family site, we might have different rules that govern that site as compared to other locations. So they're not fully set, but we do expect behavior components.
Which is reasonable. So what do we do with the people who won't go to a shelter or a site that we create because there are these rules?
That's a very good question, and one that we're continuing to grapple with, because we recognize that when we have places for people to be, our hope is that they take advantage of the opportunity to go there and have safer places. And so it's something, quite frankly, that we're in conversation with. I'm in conversation with Matt. I'm in conversation with Chief Skinner, and we're talking about how we will move forward in terms of enforcement.
And you guys are doing an incredible job. I wouldn't want to do your job. It's so hard. But it's my job to ask the hard question, right? Because members of the community kind of expect me to do that. So my problem all along has been that we can create all the opportunities we want to, but without the other side of the coin, where it is required that you take these opportunities, the problem won't get fixed. And so I'm trying to find where that line is. When we say, well, we've created all these new places, let's go to the other end of the spectrum. And I specifically love to hear from Chief Skinner here about his strategies, because I can see he's on the call. If hypothetically we could create enough space for every unhoused person to be in what we're creating, then enforcement could be done legally. In that hypothetical, Chief, how would you do enforcement differently? I know I'm putting you on the spot, man. I'm sorry, but I'm going to do it.
No, that's all right. It's a put me in coach type of moment, right?
Right.
Good evening to everybody. Sorry for the casualness of my surroundings. I'm actually sitting at the corner of 7th and Oscar right now. I came out to kind of take a look at what happened today because we had a lot of resources out here, and taking a look at our cul-de-sacs out here and watching how those are shaping up. You know, one of the challenges that we have in this state is Senate Bill 110 decriminalized pretty much all use of controlled substance that we were able to enforce. The other thing that's really challenging about that is the system by which we're trying to get people into treatment and or get a referral or take the referral questionnaire around substance abuse is largely predicated on law enforcement contact. So you think about as we're trying to get law enforcement out of these contacts with mental health and drug use, you now have created a system by which the referrals happen as a result of getting a citation by law enforcement. And so the key is that whether or not we've done something without taking into consideration whether we have the resources to actually do it in a consistent and robust fashion. And, you know, I think all of us can think back that the whole conversation around the community safety initiative right now was all, the genesis of that was around the fact that we've got victims of crime every single week that go without the types of services that this council wants them to have. And so we're thinking about adding yet another layer of enforcement and or overwatch by this police department without having even the resources to fulfill our core of our mission. So when you ask how we're going to be able to do this in a sanctioned camp to do those kinds of things, I would say that we need to think about building a mechanism by which we match that resource with the need. And in some cases, I suggest that it's not a badge-wearing police officer that we dedicate to that we start somewhere else and reserve our men and women in uniform for when we have significant safety or criminal behavior issues like what we're starting to see in some of these more, I'm going to call them organized in the sense that they're all congregate together, but not necessarily organized in the sense they have oversight. But we're starting to see some of that criminal behavior start to happen in the adjacent neighborhoods and business parts.
Well, I appreciate your answer, and I agree entirely. The challenge for me is that the municipal judge works for the council. And in my opinion, that's where, as a condition of sentencing, the judge has the legal authority to say, you can't continue to illegal camp. You must live in a provided opportunity, and you must live by those rules. And that's the reasonable answer for us to live together as a society. And from my perspective, I'd like to have a more thorough discussion with our municipal judge about holding people truly accountable so that they're not just ignoring the opportunities we've created here, but instead are compelled to take some of them. I'd like a third round, please, Mayor.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Mike. I don't know whether we're going to have time for you to have a third round, but let's just, we've got 12 minutes to go. So we have Councilor Randy and then Claire and then Matt. And I know that Randy has a couple of motions. So I'm hoping we can circle around this conversation first before we go into a robust discussion of your motions, Randy, but I do want to offer you a chance to speak.
Mayor, this is Claire. You can take me out of the queue. I'm fine.
Okay.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree with so much of what I'm hearing, and I could cite pretty much every counselor that said something, but I do want to cue in on Councilor Keating. I had metrics on my list as well, but I just ran out of time. I cannot imagine spending the kind of money we are talking about without having some way to measure progress and regression. I think that's critical. That's our responsibility as fiscal managers of the public's money. With that said, and teeing off of Councilor Simple's simple comment, we need relief now. I have two motions. The first motion is dealing with actual challenges that we are having in the industrial area with getting trucking in and out because of the way the streets are being tied up and used. There just isn't the swing space. There is not the turning radius or room for the crank bangles to make 90-degree turns into driveways and travel lanes to get to loading docks and loading, unloading yards. So with that, motion one, move to direct the city manager to return to council within 2 weeks with a proposed plan for actions intended to address vehicle camping through parking restrictions in the West Eugene commercial industrial area. Those administrative actions should include, number one, implementation of no parking zones on one side of each street in the area. Number two, no parking zones on both sides of the street where private travel lanes or driveways lead to loading docks or loading unloading yards requiring a 90-degree turn from the street. And three, the provision of limited duration parking on the side of streets where parking is allowed in areas recommended by staff.
Before we jump into this, all right, I was going to try and finish up the first round of motions so that we would complete that business before we go into the discussion of the second, if you wouldn't mind. So
can I withdraw that then, and then will I have time to come back to that?
I will do it. We will definitely come back to it. So I just would like to wrap up the first item.
The second's okay with that withdrawal.
I appreciate that very much. So
thank you, Mayor. You're correct.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. So I have both Matt and Greg with their hands raised, so if we can, and we probably will need to extend.
Thanks, Mayor. I'll be brief because I want to get to that conversation. I want to thank Councilor Evans for and staff for recognizing the potential pathway for FEMA funding. I'm often talking with neighbors about FEMA-style emergency low barrier shelter. It would be appropriate, especially considering the numbers that we are experiencing, the highest unhoused population per capita than any county in the country, right here in Lane County. It would be most appropriate to utilize FEMA funding. I believe, Matt, you said it earlier on the conversation, every site must see some level of management to be successful. And I appreciate the chief's response that that we should match the resource to the need, and in some cases that's not a badge-wearing officer. And I want to applaud our service providers and folks at rest stops in particular who volunteer their time to provide some of that self-policing or management. And thank you to staff for that yeoman's work as well. Councilor Zelenka was spot on early on in the conversation, recognizing that what got us here: wage disparity, rising housing costs, severe disinvestment by both the state and the federal government in regards to mental health services and substance abuse services. We can and should be doing much better, and this puts us on the pathway to do better. But getting our federal partners to have some sort of buy-in, whether it's through the American Rescue Plan and then some, and capitalizing on potential FEMA funding, put me in the category of an enthusiastic yes, whatever you need from council to make that request to come to fruition. And finally, Councilor Zelenka, I alluded to your request for a work session. And I want to reiterate to colleagues that 99.9% of the time I'm a yes for a work session to have the conversation. But I really look forward to seeing polling that tells me I'm wrong, that the community has supported through property tax one too many times. Look, let me frame it this way. The Lane Community College bond passed in the last election cycle, and the Eugene Public Library levy passed in the last election cycle. They're beloved institutions. Without any disrespect to our unhoused population, as evidenced by growing consternation and concern in the community, I don't think our unhoused population are a beloved institution. I think we need to get a little more creative, whether that's a surcharge tax or a consumption fee in regards to funding this permanently.
Thank you. Greg.
Yeah. Thanks, Mayor. A couple things real quick. When we're talking about levies and new taxes and things of that sort, I go back to our CSI and the fact that we've been looking at, we've got various committees and workshops looking at how those funds should be distributed and spent. So initially, we were looking at fixing some of the holes that we had in the police department, both with personnel and with other things that the police need. One of the things I would like to suggest is before we completely lock that down, what I'm thinking is that we need to look at, and I want to have Chief Skinner jump in on this, putting more money into CSOs, community service officers, who don't wear uniforms, who maybe carry a badge, but they're not openly displaying a badge, and assigning those officers to specific trouble spots so that you can have a quicker reaction that is a it's an official reaction, but at the same time, it's not an armed police reaction to the situation that is occurring in these various spots. Because we've been hearing a lot from the community, at least I have, that we want more money invested in social services. We want more money invested in non-police oriented kind of responses. And so I would invite the chief to talk a little bit about that, and for us to look at getting more CSOs on the street so that we can manage some of these situations without having to call it a uniformed officer or officers to a spot unless there's an absolute dire emergency and crisis in play.
Yeah, I'm happy to just respond real quickly because I know council's running out of time. The police department from the start of the CSI has tried to be really focused on what the outcome is of the community safety initiative is. That's why it's called the Community Safety Initiative, is we're looking at what is best for this community and what helps this community not only be safer, but feel safer. And sometimes those metrics are very different around a sense of safety versus the statistical analysis we do around safety. Additional CSOs is well within our ability to build those teams. We want to have a healthy balance between being able to respond to those low-level calls for service with a different response and recognizing that this city of 178,000 is still requiring a significant multiple car response to very, very violent and very dangerous calls, not to mention the complexity of the investigations that we're seeing now in this digital age is just unbelievable. So I think there's a balance there, but I would just leave you with this last thought about the CSI is, when we think about adjusting the CSI dollars, if we adjust the CSI dollars through the lens of making sure that the outcome is enhanced public safety, enhanced community safety, I firmly believe if we get more people stabilized, if we get more people off the street that are not engaging in survival behavior, that's often also criminal in nature, that is a positive impact on our public safety, it's a positive impact on our community safety. And so I'm ready to sit at the table and look at and have really good, robust discussions about what a revamped CSI might mean for this community.
Thank you. It is 6:59. I would like to turn to Jennifer to put a motion on the table.
Sure. The first one is move to direct the city manager to schedule an April 26, 2021 public hearing on the ordinance sent forth in attachment F of this AIS with the revised May 1st, 2023 sunset date. And due to the immediate need to establish lawful sites to park vehicles or erect tents, authorize the abbreviated notice of the public hearing date as allowed pursuant to Section 28, subsection 4 of the Eugene Charter.
Second.
Okay, any discussion, need for clarification? All in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Excellent. That passes. Thank you very much. And that takes care of that. The second motion would be an alternative date, correct? Yeah. Okay. So thank you all very much. And that we're over time, but I'm gonna go back to Randy's motion to at least have a chance to put that on the table.
Thank you, Mayor. Would you like me to reread it?
No, I think everyone's yes. Do you want it? I think everyone
can
knows.
be. You don't need to. No, it was previously put on the table, and Councilor Clark, you re-seconded.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It looks like. Do you need to speak to it more, Randy, before I turn to Alan?
I just want to say this is critical to our businesses and our workers. These are hundreds of jobs we're talking about in West Eugene, and they are having a hard time conducting business. We also have raw sewage being dumped in the street, and there's a number of businesses out there that prepare food. It's just a bad situation. We need to get control of this. This isn't something that can wait 6 months. This isn't something that can wait a year. We need to be moving now, and it's still going to take time before we can actually enact this if we are to pass it. So I strongly urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this. I've given this a lot of thought. I've talked to a lot of people about it. I've had help with this with city staff. I think that's enough.
Okay, I have Alan and then Matt.
So I kind of like where Randy's going, but one of the problems is his predecessor was fond of saying that this is a whack-a-mole problem. We whack it over here, it pops up over here, and so we're still and this sounds like that to me. And when I look at this map of where all this is, it's everywhere. It's not just in the West Eugene area. So I'm wondering if, Randy, you would allow for a friendly amendment that at the end of the first sentence that reads, in the West Eugene commercial industrial area, change that to in commercial industrial areas. And that would make it broader to this applicability.
I would be amenable to that if my second would agree. I think this is something, there's other areas in town that could end up with the same problem. And, if we start shutting down businesses and losing jobs, we're going to have more people that we're going to need to help falling into homelessness.
Right. Because if we do it there, then it moves over there, and then we moves over there, and then we keep chasing it.
So yes.
Second agrees.
Thank you.
Okay, Matt and then Emily.
Thank you, Mayor. Quick question for staff. Our April 26th public hearing will review the current code limitations and potential solutions that was sent to us this afternoon in regards to storage of vehicles on streets, parking time limit, commercially marked vehicles, prohibited stopping, standing, and parking, and permitted overnight sleeping and permitted overnight sleeping rest stop program. Is that correct?
So I want to defer to something that Christy said before. The public hearing that you just scheduled is for that ordinance. The public hearing scheduled for the 26th is for the ordinance to establish the safe vehicle spots. The discussion that would be the work session to talk about what you just listed, which are the code limitations and potential solutions, that would be a separate work session. And Christy, my understanding is we were looking at the 26th, the April 26th, to have that work session on those code limitations. Is that the date that you're intending? I don't want to.
Yeah, we were looking to have that conversation. City manager and I talked about that today as a potential option to reschedule one of the items that is scheduled for that date currently.
Okay, thank you. So I would think that this topic would be great to absorb more. There was a lot of change over the weekend. And so rather than do something post haste, I would be more comfortable tackling these subjects all together. I recognize the immediacy, but it's already scheduled on April 26th for a public work session. I would welcome public input and move to table to date specific April 26th.
We have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, let's vote on, we have discussion on that. Anybody wants to discuss this move to table to a work session? Okay, Mike?
Oh, sorry.
Mayor, this issue is critical. And by critical, I mean there are businesses in this area. There are people who have waited for us to act for far too long. And even if it is something we'll cover in more detail later, and even if it's something that we'll do better later with more detail, acting now in this specific way is, if nothing else, a sign that we're listening to how bad it is for people in our community and that we need to do something now. And I'm sorry, I agree with Councillor Keating that there are wiser ways that we can incorporate this with other work, but we need to act now. And I, for one, will absolutely vote in favor of Councillor Grove's motions.
Councillor Semple, did you want to speak to this?
Thank you. I said earlier that everybody's desperate for something they can see for us to do right now. We've been reading the emails and Randy's run ragged answering them and going to visit everybody. It's incredibly commendable. So I do have to admit that which side the parking signs are go on and how long, I'm kind of a map person, so I can't say, yes, I absolutely agree to that specific plan. I will vote for it. We have to do something, but I have my regular concern, which is we're telling you to leave with nowhere to go. And we need to get rid of the crime. I said, take that blue bus down there and just park it in the middle of the street and watch. Let's deal with the crime that's not about camping. But that's not what this is about. We have to do something now. But boy, I really want to have a place where we can tow those vehicles. Thank you.
Alan.
Yeah, I usually like to have some time to sit with things. I did talk with Councillor Groves about this today, and so I'm comfortable with the motion, and maybe this will help Councillor Keating a little bit. The way the motion's structured is that actually we're not voting to implement anything. We're actually voting to bring it up in 2 weeks, which would be the 26th, or it can be the 26th. So what this really does is it says, staff, go away, work on this, bring this back to us. And that probably the 26th is when it'll come back. So in essence, it's doing exactly what you said. And then it'll give us some time to think about it, talk to our constituents and talk to each other, and also get some information back from staff in that meanwhile. So I hope that helps you, Councillor Keating. And with that, I want to see what comes back, but so I'm willing to have it go forward for now.
All right, I see Randy and then Matt again, so.
Thank you, Mayor. Just quickly, exactly what Councillor Zelenka said. My want is to provide some framework around what we expect to see back. That's what this is for. We will get a chance to talk on this some more. I wish we could move faster, but that's just the reality of our world. So I don't want to waste any more time. I want to get moving on this. These people need relief. Thank you.
Okay, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Councillor Groves, for the presenting this thoughtful discussion. I want to get to a place where I'm supportive. I do want to offer that I think that it's a bit overly prescriptive, and like Councillor Semple pointed out, we have a history of embracing a dislocation strategy rather than relocation tactics. It's one more time where the cart is before the horse. There's not necessarily enough places for folks to legitimately camp in the midst of a global pandemic. I recognize and I get the consternation and frustration from the business community. I just have a little heartburn over the email threads over the last 72 hours that have changed. And I don't know if this sets a precedent for how council advances policy in the future. And so I hear you, Councillor Zelenka, that this comes back to us in 2 weeks, but I'd be much more comfortable fleshing this out in 2 weeks rather than getting something in the 11th hour and fleshing it out live as we speak. And so without any disrespect, Councillor Groves, I will be voting in the affirmative to table the motion, and we'll go from there back to the original motion. Based on the results of that. But I hope colleagues will recognize the wisdom in packaging these issues together rather than operating hastily.
Motion to postpone, not table, right, Catherine?
Thank you for the clarification, Councillor Clark. It was a motion to table to a date specific. My apologies.
Okay, any other need to comment on this? I'll just weigh in that I'm hearing this conversation. I really agree with Matt in the sense that you don't want to rush on something which we haven't really had a chance to digest or discuss. I am hearing that Alan is suggesting that this is a plan to discuss it, which makes it seem like kind of a moot point if it's on the council agenda already to be discussed in 2 weeks. I'm not sure the need to vote today, but I'm understanding that for your constituents, you're wishing to set a tone that you're moving forward. You're moving forward in 2 weeks with or without this motion today. Councillor Randy, you want to speak to that?
Yes. No, Mayor, I'm not trying to speak to my constituents. I'm trying to do what's right here. This is based on geometry and physics. It takes so much room to maneuver a large delivery truck, semis, tractor trailer rigs. And this is specifically around that. That's why it's so prescriptive. And this is their bread and butter. This is how they afford to pay employees. This isn't some philosophical, I'll stop there, but they need this.
I'm not questioning the need, Randy. I was just questioning whether this motion, if we're going to discuss it in 2 weeks, whether we need to vote to discuss it in 2 weeks, if it's already on the agenda, but
I would like it to come back framed specifically.
Gotcha. All right, so we have a motion on the table to postpone the vote to a date certain. So all in favor, please raise your hand.
Was there a second to that?
Oh, I thought there was, yes. Yeah, Jennifer seconded. All in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, all 3. All opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so that fails. So we're back to the original motion. Are there councilors who still need to speak to the original motion? Are we ready for a vote?
With the friendly amendment, right, Mayor?
With the friendly amendment that is a little broader. All in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Opposed? 1. Thank you very much. That passes. Thank you, all of you, for that conversation, and we will return to this topic in just a couple of weeks. And with that, we're adjourned. I'll see you back here in 16 minutes.